fresh news of Bel Air. That's Bridget, Helen, and Claire. This week's topic is
U.S. history.
First, let's explore the economic policy in the U.S.
I don't know about you guys, but whenever I think of economic policy, I immediately think Roaring Twenties.
Really? Because I think of the Great Depression.
And that's why we're going to talk about both.
The 1920s were a time of great prosperity. One big reason for that is all the new inventions being made.
Oh yeah, the assembly line, which is used all the time today, was actually created in the 20s by Henry Ford.
I know, when Henry Ford invented the assembly line, he used it on one of his cars called the Model T, and it was way less expensive to make and to buy.
One of the reasons was because he wasn't paying professionals to build a whole car. He could pay the average worker to work on a small part of it and make many more cars.
So more people had jobs. Another reason why the 1920s was so economically successful was because of the culture.
And that culture was consumerism.
Consumerism was encouraged by new business practices that were also invented during the 20s, like when companies made products that were intended to break quickly so that people would have to come back and buy more.
Called planned obsolescence.
Yeah, the 20s were great. That was, at least, until the Great Depression hit.
With the invention of credit in the 20s came problems. Because the economy was so good, consumers became too confident and bought items on credit that they couldn't really afford, creating a bubble in the economy.
This led to the start of the banking crisis, which was when banks were running out of money.
On October 24th, 1929, many investors began selling their stock because they were worried about rising interest rates. That made the stock prices drop to a shocking new low 5 days later. The days were nicknamed Black Thursday and Black Tuesday.
Basically, the stock market crashed.
This caused a ripple effect, where the public started to panic and tried to take all their money out of the bank while they still could, leading to even more banks closing.
It was really difficult for people to make a living during the Great Depression, and a lot of them were forced to live in shanty towns, which they nicknamed Hoovervilles, after Herbert Hoover, the president at the time.
People didn't really like Hoover because of his laissez-faire attitude, and so when the next presidential election came, they elected FDR, who was running on the promise to end the Depression.
FDR's plan to get the country out of its depression was called the First New Deal, and it offered the 3 R's.
Relief, recovery, and reform.
The public really supported FDR, and they especially liked the Second New Deal, which created a bunch of acts to reform the economy. One of these was the Works Progress Administration, and another is the Social Security Act, which we still have today.
That story's really interesting to me. I think that it's kind of can be really important for the government to be involved in business, at least
sometimes. Yeah, it's crazy to think that the government used to not be involved and be so detached from the economy.
Okay, next we'll be exploring foreign policy.
After World War II, many European countries were disenfranchised, and so the only two superpowers that were left was the USSR and America. And because they had opposing ideologies, communism versus capitalism, they were butting heads.
In 1946, Winston Churchill delivered a speech at Westminster College to warn about the dangers of communism. He condemned the spread of communism and said, quote, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent."
The Iron Curtain is a metaphor for the border surrounding communist nations. Churchill wanted to keep communism within these nations and not let it spread beyond the Iron Curtain.
The American public was afraid of communism spreading, and this widespread fear was characterized as the Red Scare. This panic was escalated by the fact that both superpowers had nuclear weapons.
To prevent the spread of communism, the U.S. provided aid to countries feeling pressure from the Soviet regime.
This was the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan was also a way of combating communism in the form of helping capitalist countries.
Also related to foreign policy and happening at around the same time as the Cold War was the Vietnam War. When Vietnam was split by communism and capitalism, the U.S. intervened.
The way the war started was kept secret at first and was therefore extremely controversial. After being revealed that Kennedy was putting troops in Vietnam without declaring war first, the public was outraged.
Because of the lack of support for the war from the public, Johnson wasn't reelected. JFK won on the promise of ending the war, and his policies were far different from Johnson's.
Overall, the Vietnam War was a foreign affair that the U.S. shouldn't have been involved in.
Okay, next let's discuss domestic policy in the Progressive Era and in the 60s.
After McKinley's death, Teddy Roosevelt rose to the presidency and started enacting policies that would help the average American.
Among these new reforms were the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act, and the 16th and 17th Amendments.
The 16th created graduated income tax, and the 17th made the direct election of U.S. senators by the American people, which are still around today.
President Woodrow Wilson was also very progressive.
Under his presidency, he made efforts to reform big businesses and banks, which was in the Federal Reserve Act. He also created the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition, and the 19th, which was women's suffrage.
Wilson did a lot of work regarding the safety of his citizens, including improving city conditions and labor reform.
Meanwhile, in the 60s, domestic policy was a lot different.
In the 60s, people were especially upset with the way the Vietnam War was handled and kept secret. It sparked nationwide resentment for the government, aka the student movement.
A big part of the student movement was protesting, and at one protest at Kent State, which is a college, 4 students were killed by the National Guard.
The public was outraged because the government was killing its own people.
Later in the 60s, the relationship between the public and the government became much better, and the government started to become more involved in civil rights.
After the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, segregated schools in the South had to become integrated by law.
When schools started first desegregating, the government had to get involved to help protect the lives of the students that were coming in from different schools.
As support grew for the civil rights movement, the public became more accepting of the government in their lives. So when Johnson wanted to enforce his Great Society policy, the public welcomed it.
One of the major aspects of Johnson's Great Society was the War on Poverty, an effort to end the poverty in America.
Since we're on the topic of progressivism, why don't we talk about diverse identities in America?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Throughout history, African Americans have been the main target for racial intolerance. The civil rights movement was a way to gain their rights. They did this through peaceful protests, sit-ins, and boycotts.
And with the civil rights movement, other movements were also taking action. Marginalized groups like members of the LGBTQ community, Native Americans, and women were all also protesting for their own equal rights.
The NAACP is an organization that was created to protect the rights of African Americans. They helped advance civil rights in legal court cases. One of these was Brown v. Board of Education.
Another civil rights event took place on June 28, 1969. This event was called the Stonewall Riots, which were a series of uprisings against police who raided a gay bar.
This was essentially the beginning of the gay rights movement.
Now, let's talk about marginalized groups in World War II.
Yeah, let's do it.
After Pearl Harbor, the government was worried that Japanese Americans living in the West Coast would pose a threat to national security. As a result, FDR issues Executive Order 9066, commonly referred to as Japanese internment.
This forcibly relocated all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast into internment camps. These Americans were forced to uproot their lives during the duration of World War II.
During World War II, women were encouraged to work because it was a total war,
which is when everybody in the population is mobilized to help the war effort.
Yeah, and because there were more women in the workforce, gender roles shifted temporarily and women were feeling more empowered.
Well, that's all we have for you guys this week.
I don't know about you guys, but I had fun.
So did I.
Yeah,
it was okay.
See you next week! That was the fresh news of Bel Air. Ever wondered if your house is infested with toxic mold? Tune in next week to find out.